The title of my talk for this morning is Masters of Compassion. Now, when we think of compassion, many of us have, I would say, rather varying ideas and attitudes relating to that word. Some of us perhaps think of compassion more as pity. Some of us think of compassion as being more objective rather than involved with something. Indeed, when I have asked various people what compassion means to them, I've been interested to discover that usually almost everyone speaks of his or her own need, yearning, or sometimes failure to comprehend or inability to feel a certain something, and therefore it's not quite understandable. For example, think how often we have heard certain criticisms made of some of the things that Jesus had to say, like when he said, "Do good to them that despitefully use you," and love your enemies. Of course, with most of us, that is, those of us who have had enemies, has anyone here never had an enemy? I confess to having had an enemy or two. Now, however, those of us who have had enemies or who have felt that we have one, to our emotions it was real, whether it was real or not in other ways, surely we know that the hardest thing in the world to do is to feel benevolent towards anyone who we feel or figure has wished us ill or has attempted to do us ill, or who has attempted to do ill to someone near and dear to us. I think it's harder there yet if it's a child or someone very close. That is when we have the most difficult time in feeling benevolent towards a person. I must confess that that's one area I still watch myself, because if it comes to anyone criticizing me, well, I figure that's their right. It doesn't seem very important. But for example, what do you think would happen to you if you criticized my Jacob? You see, I would become very indignant, and yet what? That's a mild term. and yet, what would have called this forth, this emotion? You see, the whole point I'm trying to make is that if we want to understand compassion, which we want to try to understand together here at least, then we'll be able to better discuss what the masters of compassion are and what they are not. It will help us to relieve ourselves of some of our misconceptions and perhaps help us to develop a certain quality in our natures more fully than we have had in the past. Now, one of the things we want to bear in mind is that compassion is not maudlin sentimentality or maudlin sentimental pitying. As a matter of fact, pity is not compassion. We can have pity quite often on many creatures. We can have pity regarding people. But compassion is a much larger something, because Kabbalistically speaking, compassion is involved with the depth of memory that the higher self has. In other words, your higher self, my higher self, which really is one in the self, capital S. There is a type of memory that is never lost, and this is the memory of all experience, which has brought us the understanding, which has brought us the wisdom, which has brought us the growth, which has brought us the capacity to know, to be, to feel, to think even. This memory, and on the Kabbalistic tree of life, incidentally, it's assigned to that blue sephira. Sephira, remember, means a divine emanation. It is a sphere of activity. It is therefore a sphere of the activity of qualities of consciousness. both divine and human, because one is not separate from the other. They are of the same kind, they're just different in quality and quantity, because all consciousness is basically one. Now, on this Kabbalistic tree of life, that blue sephira called mercy is assigned to the thing we call the grade of expression, the grade of attainment that relates also to masters of wisdom. Now, what is this does this mercy involve? We can analyze it with some of its symbols, which is always a good idea, and then enter into the deeper aspects of what these symbols mean. Now, the sphere of the activity of Jupiter is involved, and astrologically we know that Jupiter is called the greater benefic. Jupiter is supposed to bring us good fortune. Of course, people always think of getting a lot of money when they think of good fortune. They don't realize that money is the very least of anything. And a person can have all the billions of dollars in the world and be the most poverty-stricken individuals in the world. As a matter of fact, Kabbalah shows this very clearly, because not only is that sephira assigned to the sphere of the activity of Jupiter, but it is also assigned, remember, to memory, therefore to the memory of the higher mind, the memory of the soul, and indeed it is the memory of the mind, the memory of the soul, that's the real riches, because memory comes from experience. Again, we can say it is in the ability to measure the significance of our experience that we have true riches, and so the measuring intelligence is one of the terms Kabbalists give this area. Let's get an idea or two about the difference that's involved. We have to know the difference between richness of heart and richness materially if we're going to understand what compassion is and is not. So let's analyze it a bit. First, I'll tell you a story. Some of you have heard this story, but I'm sure you don't mind hearing it again so that those who didn't hear it can share it with us. Let me tell you a story that my mother told me when I was a child, and her father told it to her when she was a child, and his father told it to him. As a matter of fact, it goes right back down the line of our Kabbalistic tradition. It is a Kabbalistic story. In Kabbalah, there's one of the terms for master wisdom is a tzaddik. And incidentally, that's the Hebrew word for Jupiter. And it really means a merciful one, a master of compassion, as a matter of fact. Now, therefore, in the Kabbalistic tradition, certain stories are told. You know how Jesus taught in parables? It's because he was born of a Kabbalistic family down the line of David, and is sort of, you might call him a relative of mine, according to Dr. Case. And believe me, I do not disown him at all. Now, this story that my mother told me had to do with a tzaddik. She said there were two sisters lived in this very small town in an isolated area in the old country. And one of the sisters fell upon very bad fortune because her husband died. She was left a widow. And not having any ability to handle the affair, she lost everything. So she lived in a very drafty hut, and she eked out a meager existence by spinning very rough linen threads into a cloth and selling this cloth. So she barely survived, earning what little she could in this manner. Now, there was a very great storm one night. It was thundering, it was lightning, and the rain was coming down in sheets. And she heard this knock on the door. At first she couldn't be sure it was a knock because everything rattled. She went to the door and opened it, and there was this very old, very wet, very cold man. And he said, "Daughter, could you give me some hospitality? Could you take me in and give me a dry place to sleep and a bite to eat? I am caught in the storm." And she said, "Oh, Holy Father, come in immediately. Oh, what a terrible night for you to be out in. Alas, I am very poor. All I have is this one very hard mat, but it is yours. I shall gladly sleep on the bare floor, because your bones are too old to be able to stand that. And all I have is a very small portion of a loaf of bread, but I gladly give it to you and share it with you. You need it more than I do." So she gave him the little bread she had left, and he ate it, and she gave him her hard mat with the covers, and she did the best she could through the night. And in the morning, the storm had stopped. He looked at her, he said, "Daughter, for your mercy, for your kindness, I bless you. The first thing you put your hands to when I leave shall be blessed beyond measure." Remember what I said about the measuring intelligence. Beyond measure. See, this is expansiveness, Jupiter. So she thought, what a sweet blessing, and she just bowed her head. He left, and then she said, "Well, I better get to my weaving." After all, she had to try to get enough cloth together so she could have something to eat. So she sat down at her loom and she started to weave. She had the spool of rough linen thread, and she was weaving and weaving and weaving and weaving, and discovered the thread did not go down. It remained exactly the same. So she kept weaving and weaving, and she had masses of cloth, till finally she had to stop, because the call of the body comes to all mortals, as we know, and we have to attend to these delicate needs by going to that little private room to attend to it. So since this call came, she went to attend to her needs. And when she came back, she discovered the spell had been broken, that now the spool had returned to normal. Well, this woman, she had a sister, a very wealthy sister, whose husband did very well, and she excitedly told her wealthy sister about this marvelous miracle where a true tzaddik had come to her home. And the sister said, "Now, my sister, if he should come again, you must send him immediately to me. After all, an old man like that, he will appreciate having a feather bed that's warm and a house with no drafts and being fed chicken and chicken soup. That's and all the finest of food. So should he come again, you send him to me." And the poor sister said, "Yes, you are right. He would certainly have greater comfort and food and care in this manner." And sure enough, a few weeks later, he knocked on the door again, and he asked her for hospitality, and she said, "Holy Father, I would gladly take you in and share all I have with you, but I have a wealthy sister who can take much better care of you than I, and she would like you to come there to have her soft feather bed and to have the fine hot food that will make you feel so much better." So he graciously bowed his head, received the instructions, and he went to the rich sister's house. And the minute he knocked on the door, the rich sister recognized who it was, and she took him in, and she gave him of the very best, and she gave him the most wonderful soft feather bed with lovely covers. He really was treated like a king. And when he got up in the morning, he said to her, "My daughter, for your kindness and hospitality, I bless you. The first thing you do after I leave shall be blessed beyond measure and into the expansion of the universe." And then he left. So the rich sister thought, "Aha, that stupid sister of mine. She's so dumb, she doesn't know whether she's coming or going. Now I'm going to go and attend to that private duty first, and then I'll go and weave my gold cloth." And she had this gold thread all prepared. So she went. And I asked my mother, "Mama, then what happened? What happened?" And my mother shrugged her shoulders as her father had shrugged his shoulders before, and his father before. Shrugged her shoulders. She said, "Who knows? No doubt she's attending to her duty yet." Now, you see, there's quite a fantastic lesson involved in this delightful story, because we get such erroneous ideas as to what compassion or mercifulness really is. Now, Kabbalistically, if we want to understand true compassion, and therefore at least to have an inkling as to what to expect from masters of compassion, as I pointed out, maudlin sentimentality had better go by the board. Because you see, in order to attain to that grade, one has to previously come through the number 5 sephira, the one that is red, and it is called severity. It is also called justice. Now, a sense of justice is something that every single master would automatically have before you could remotely think of him as a master of wisdom, because you have to have gone through this tests and trials of handling power. And as we know, one of the major things wrong in the world is the fact that almost everyone who is in public life is there for one reason only, because they have a power drive and they fight and bite and claw and cheat, and they'll do anything to get that power. And those that have the power are easily bought in order to be able to retain their power. It's a disease, this this need for power. And those who have such an appetite certainly could not remotely understand what true compassion is, because they would not yet have gone through the tests and trials that have to do with how we handle power. All we have to do is look at the world to find out how power is being handled by the ones who claw their way through anything to get it. Now, a master of compassion has been through more than one incarnation where, without having a drive for power, he or she has had to go through having the various kinds of power and have utilized that power with justice and with mercy, so that it is the balance of justice and mercy, as we see the red and the blue. It is the balancing of justice and compassion. It is the ability to recognize what is for the greater good and to act in that manner, that which is for the greater good, which really helps to describe at least one aspect of what a master of compassion really is. We have a tendency to think that a master of compassion is one who knows how to feel sorry for all of us because we hurt. And this is nonsense. We feel sorry for children that are whooping it up because we don't give them a knife to cut themselves with. I mean, we feel sorry that they're crying, that is. But we certainly aren't in the least inclined to want to give them the knife. And in the same way, a master of compassion can be aware of the rest of us weeping and crying out. But if we're weeping and crying out for something that is self-damaging, certainly we can't or shouldn't be thinking of a master of compassion as sentimentally saying, "Oh, poor baby," on his heart, "Oh, poor little one." I do, but that's different. Poor baby, poor little one. Oh, let's see what we can do to help the darling, so that the darling won't cry. No, what a master of compassion does to help is to do exactly nothing wherever we are making all of these painful situations for ourselves. It's the master of compassion having this great depth of wisdom when we deliberately go out to get ourselves involved in situations because we just want excitement, or we're bored, or we're trying to fool ourselves or kid ourselves that we want a special something, mainly because it sounds exciting. The master of compassion has gone through enough of the lives, the tests and the trials, so that there is an awareness of what the true motivation is. And so a master of compassion usually hasn't got time to waste over the infants who are going to still have a need to whoop it up. In other words, a parent lets children work out the excess energy in the playground, and very happily. If it rains, of course, they have to put up with them in the house. And of course, if it rains, and spiritually speaking, a master of compassion occasionally puts up with a little nonsense here and there, but not too much, because the master of compassion has this realization as to what is damaging to an individual. And when you love, the one thing you're going to be careful about is to see to it that you do not aid and abet that which is damaging to the loved one. You see, our lack of wisdom makes us want so many things that aren't really for our benefit. For example, let's take the idea of security, going back to the things a master of wisdom knows, the kind of riches a master of wisdom would have. Now, too many of us have the erroneous idea that security is being able to get enough money stuck away in a bank or in investments. In other words, we think of security as a material thing. And yet, as Jesus said, lay not up for yourself treasures where dust and moths can corrupt. Because this is not true riches. As a matter of fact, some of the richest people in the world are the most insecure and also the stingiest, incidentally. The more money, the more they look at a bunch of numbers in a book, you know, that says I'm worth so much, the more excited they become at trying to add numbers. And they live poverty-stricken lives, basically, while they excitedly read the numbers. You know, oh, 2 million, my God, 6 million. Oh, I'm going to make, I wonder, I'm going to make it 1 billion. And then slash, hit, you know. You can't be, if a person is insecure and decides material things will bring the security, you know, this then becomes a temptation to step over anything and anyone. Ethics, morals, go by the wayside and are rationalized. So after all, we have to live, or something like that. Some living. Anyway, the master of wisdom has gone through enough experiences, has developed the insight and the wisdom, the knowledge, the understanding that the only security there is in the security of self. In other words, what I feel in my heart, what I feel in my spirit, in my soul. That's the only security I have. I could have $10 billion. I'd like to, incidentally. I'm not against it. Look at the nice temple we could build, you know, with stained glass tarot key windows and stained glass tree of life, you know. But that would be fun. But I mean, that isn't, you see what I mean? I'm not against having it. We're talking about the appetites and what it is we consider potent or important as against what isn't. Now then, the master of wisdom would see that there isn't anything material that we don't have to leave sooner or later. You see, you could have $1 trillion. I don't know if anybody has it, but at least some of them act like they think they do. You could have $1 trillion, and sooner or later, somebody else is going to get it. Sooner or later, because we are not physically immortal. We are spiritually immortal. So sooner or later, we're going to either drop dead of a coronary, if God is good to us, or we'll go some slow route, if that's the kind of karma we've earned and our soul needs it. But sooner or later, our soul will withdraw from the physical body. And then what is it going to take with it? What will it have? It will have only that riches which it has really made, earned, the spinning and weaving of the stuff of life. Have I been kind? Have I been just? Have I given love? Have I given tenderness? Have I brought light? Whatever amount. Have I developed my own light? Have I got something to give? You know, you can give money, and believe me, sometimes money can save a life. This is true. We're not saying it can't. We're not underestimating the importance of its use for exchange. What we're talking about is the evaluation in what is and is not security. And therefore, what we have to come to realize is that if we give up our lives into a sort of physical, material level ambitiousness, we have sold ourselves. We have been Judas. We have sold ourselves, what was it, for six pieces of silver? 30? 30 pieces, you see? I guess maybe that's why he was tempted. It's more than 6. It was the 30 pieces of silver. Actually, each and every one of us, any time materialistic values make us go against our true integrity, the integrity of the soul, We have become, anytime we do that, we have been faithless to ourselves. We have truly sold our self, the Christ self, down the river for those pieces of silver. Or if you want to call them green pieces of paper, what difference? This is what we have done to ourselves, because the story of Jesus, remember, the story of the whole crucifixion is the story of the evolution of humanity. And each and every one of us are a crucified, anointed one of God in various stages of our own unfoldment, having to find out what counts. What are we going to take with us? A master of compassion has found out so completely that the only riches there is riches of consciousness. That's why Jupiter is assigned to the higher mind, you know. Even astrologically, Sagittarius is the ninth house of which Jupiter is the ruler, and the ninth house is the higher mind, religion, philosophy, long journeys. And you see, expanded consciousness is what? It is the journey of consciousness, expanded, extended. So Jupiter is the expansion. Jupiter is the richness, it's the extension. But when we make the mistake of limiting it to a physical expansion, in other words, a lot of money, or a lot of whatever is worth a lot of money, physical plane, we have, because of our delusion, because of our false materialistic orientation, we have, as I said, usually sold ourselves down the river. And the Judases are really always the Judases that betray their own Christhood, their own divinity. Because remember, humanity is the begotten of God. We are made in the image and likeness of the Most High. And every time we make something that is a changing and certainly non-lasting aspect of life a goal. Like, I'll put in so many men particularly, and sometimes because they're goaded by their women who have appetites that can't stop, though sometimes it's by their own ambition they're goaded. They work, say, 10, 12, 15 hours every day in order, I want to make more money, I want to get more of this and more of that. And then I'll feel secure, and then all of a sudden, there they are, they find themselves in the hereafter. We always hope upstairs, but you remember the story of the man who died and appeared at the pearly gates asking for admission into heaven. And when the book of his life was investigated, they hunted and they couldn't find any good deeds. And they questioned him, said, isn't there something you did? Isn't there even one thing you ever did that was a good deed? And he just tried. Oh, finally he remembered he once gave a nickel to a blind man. And so at least they had found one good deed. And St. Peter went to God and said, told God, this was a case they didn't quite know what to do about him, because at least they did find this one good deed. There was this nickel that he'd once given. And so God thought a while, and he said, well, I'll tell you what you do. You give him back his nickel and tell him go to hell. As you remember now. So, in other words, what price? What price, or what do we put a price on what? Not for how much. The master of compassion, then, is not a maudlin sentimentalist. A master of compassion has reached the point where, having gone through the certain previous grades of realization and awareness, having gone through pain and anguish, because we all do, every one of us, in order to find out what's important. Having done this, the Master of Wisdom has come to the realization, recognizes thoroughly, that to work 10, 12, 15 hours every day in order to be free to do other things means that you've sold all that time down the river, because finally you drop dead, and then what chance did you get to perform your good deeds, to expand your consciousness, to aspire to work at becoming something more beautiful, wiser, something more in accordance with the highest ideals of the soul? You see, when we keep putting these things off, we don't seem to realize that we are within time and space right now. Within our consciousness is concentrated into this strange miracle that we call time and space. And this is the gift of God. Because in timelessness, we're not going to have any opportunity to expand consciousness, since it's an all-overness. But what will we have in this all-overness? Will we have the richness of our own self-awareness, full of the depth of experience, the everlasting individuality, full of beauty? How much of it will we have grown for ourselves? These are the questions. What is worthwhile? The only worthwhile thing there is in life, we finally come to recognize. And we all have to have wept quite a bit through untold numbers of incarnations to finally develop the kind of value that is able to say, for the richness of awareness, this I am grateful. To use my awareness in order to grow more awareness of who and what I am, of the significance of life, of the significance of evolution, of the significance of awareness itself, of senses, the significance of being able to sense color, to taste food, to have interactions with other centers of life, which is such a miracle. For this, I give my all. If somebody offered you all the wealth in the universe, if you would give up, say, a certain amount of your individuality or a certain amount of the richness of past experience, would you be willing to do it? Of course not. Or would you? The Master of Compassion has achieved such a feeling of unity with the rest of life that there isn't a single pain going on anywhere that isn't shared. But it is shared in a way other than, shall we say, those of us who become too maudlin or sentimental. You know, that is, not that I'm against sentimentality, I'm talking about the maudlin sentimentality. That is all wrong. For example, the only way we can really have compassion for another is to have, at some time or other in past incarnations or this one, to have gone through some kind of experience where we are able to put ourselves in the other person's place. Do you know that it actually takes an act of imagination and an act of consciousness to put yourself in another person's place, even when it's done automatically? It's just that we've done it so often that we don't have to think about it, just like it took an act of imagination and an act of consciousness to learn how to do anything, to dress ourselves, to walk, to read, to draw, to sew, to cook, no matter what it is. Now, this ability to know what another human being is feeling has with it a type of tenderness, that is, to the Master of Compassion, which does not involve even the slightest desire to stop that person from having the privilege of that painful experience. Now, this may surprise you. When I first had certain impacts with Master R, I was pretty upset with him, I can tell you that. In fact, I even wondered if he was really a Master of Wisdom at all, let alone a Master of Compassion, because I had false ideas as to what compassion really is and what compassion is not. And I thought he should be feeling very sorry for me. You know, after all, I was pretty noble and I was quite aspiring. I was also quite young and nonsensical, but that I didn't recognize naturally, and he did. Today, I marvel at the patience that Master R did show in my connection with him. And I marvel at the patience that Dr. Paul Foster Case showed, who was the channel for him to get us together until I attained my own ability to have my consciousness attuned to Master R. I marvel at the patience either of them had when I think back at the nonsense and the unrealistic ideas I had as to what a master was and was not. And, of course, today, lots of people marvel at me, that I have patience about certain things. Yes, one of my beloveds is shaking her head because she has been very impatient with me many a time, for my sake, you understand. And I've very lovingly understood it. But, for example, let's just take a little homely example or two. For example, suppose right here in the temple, some member of the temple got, as us young ones say today, uptight. You know, you older people have to get used to that, but, you know, but I just barely, not quite 21, you understand, that I have to speak the lingo of my generation now. So, suppose one of the members of the temple got uptight with me, quite annoyed, and made cracks against me. Now, suppose another member of the temple hearing this would get very indignant, say, well, which is a good thing to do, always get indignant if that happens. But this indignation actually had a need to project itself into action. And so suppose this member would come to me and say, you know, and that particular member said so-and-so and thus and thus and this and this. Incidentally, that's happened many times. Yeah, shh, don't tell anybody. And I've listened to what was said and thought, well, yeah, I see, poor darling. And then I've had a frown from the precious one who's come to tell me and say, what do you mean, poor darling? Are you going to permit that to take place? I said, well, I can't stop it. Well, why don't you do something about it? I said, well, those that are listening have to go through the test of whether they can be pulled into such nonsense and negativity. If they haven't got gratitude that somebody loves them enough to have the ecstasy and rapture and joy of sharing whatever light possible, then that's their problem. Then I feel sorrier even for them. And if the one who has the need to tear down is succeeding, then everybody has been tested, and this is the only way they're going to grow. To take hold of the one who at the moment needs to tear down. Actually, the thing that's really happening when anyone has a need to tear down, they're really tearing down themselves and don't know it. In other words, they're meeting up with something in their own nature, and because they're unable to cope with it, they're projecting it. And a teacher expects this. If you're going to get hot and bothered at what other people think and feel, then you can't really be receptive to the Master of Compassion vibratory level at all, because automatically then there is a need to react on their level, and a Master of Compassion never reacts on the level of the childish attitude that the most beautiful aspirants can have at times. After all, none of our personalities are perfected, and we should all expect that the personality will get in a stew here and there. It will get angry and indignant, especially if a certain pattern is being shaken up a bit. And it will project itself in the wrong area. Always in the higher occult training, we sit back and we permit everyone to make their mistakes. This is one of the things that aspirants have not understood about Masters of Compassion. Because if we didn't, we would really be cheating everyone. Why is it that we have such a love for the word freedom? In truth, all of us have the freedom to go in the direction that we choose to go. We have that freedom. It depends on whether we're going to be run by our negatives, you know, by our immaturities, or whether we're going to hold on to that level where the Masters of Compassion can help us. Now, the moment we are willing to overcome our own immaturity, we immediately are attuned to the master that's in charge of the particular line of work. With us, it's Master R, is in charge of this work at this time, although remember, Master Jesus of Nazareth was and is a member of this tradition, and in fact went through his entire initiation in this tradition. But the ability to be able to say, I want to transmute this quality and that quality in myself. This is what gives us the capacity to receive the help from the Masters of Compassion, and they are there at all times. You see, my loves, to try is what's important. To make a mistake is to be expected. Every true knower of the mysteries knows that we have to make mistakes in order to learn. And so there's a tender lovingness that we have towards all of our beloved children, the youngest as well as the older ones. Every time there's a fall and there are bruises, we tenderly wait in order to let our beloved children develop the strength to fall, recognize it, get up, and become more and more sure-footed. And in that manner, as our beloveds become more and more sure-footed, they gain the ability to have more and more of that eternal treasure, which is the treasure you take with you, that you cannot lose, the capacity to love, because compassion and love can be called synonymous, if you will. I love you and I care what happens to you. I care with my heart, my soul, my mind, my body, my spirit. In fact, that's all I care about. I care what happens to every single living creature, and that's all I care about, because I see this as having the rich privilege of serving God, the divine. This is light, this is beauty, this is richness. And my only prayer would be always, God, just keep me with thee, that I keep having the capacity to give of thy riches. This is being so wealthy that there isn't if you counted all of the stars in the heaven and multiplied them by infinity, that would be poverty, as against the richness of having this kind of consciousness. The consciousness that wants nothing but to do the will of the Father and is just full of joy and rejoicing. This privilege is here for you, my darlings. You are being trained to have that awareness. You are under the guidance of true love, the love of compassion that feels for your errors but does not weaken you, as you are being helped on your own with wisdom to develop your own spiritual muscles so that you too can have the ecstasy and the rapture of being an eternal giver of life and love. And that's our talk for this morning.
Let us rejoice.